ahead and get started. Many of you know that I'm Gwen Mayer, the archivist at the Hudson Library and Historical Society, and tonight we're hosting Eric Dean Wilson, author of After Cooling on Freon, Global Warming, and the Terrible Cost of Comfort. But before we get too far along, I really want to put a plug in. There's a beautiful new brochure. Well, I was going to try and hold it up. With our upcoming fall programs, I would advise you all to pick one up or go online and look at our programs. I will very briefly tell you that in August, on the 18th, which is a Wednesday, we're going to have Wall Street Journal reporter Josh Mitchell talk to us about the death trap. It's how student loans become a national catastrophe. And on August 24th, which is a Tuesday, we're going to have Rebecca Donner. She is the author of All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, the true story of an American woman in the heart of the German resistance to Hitler. Both of these are at 7 o'clock. You can go online and sign up as you usually do. So make sure you take a moment and look at that. I want to stress to you all that you can put questions in the Q&A box, which should be displayed across the bottom of your computer, and let you know that Eric's book is available. There are many copies. I was over at the Learned Owl today, and she has several there waiting for you to purchase. We'll also put a link in so that you can purchase the book. But remember, the Learned Owl carries these books in case you're interested. So tonight we're here to welcome Eric Dean Wilson, and he has written a wonderful book called After Cooling on Freon, Global Warming, and the Terrible Cost of Comfort. Eric, I have lots of questions for you, but before I get into my questions, I think it's pretty wise that we kind of give you an opportunity to give an overview of your book for most of us who have not read it yet. So I'm going to hand it to you and let you do a quick overview.
Great. Thank you so much, Gwen, and thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here digitally as I am. So this is the book, After Cooling, on Freon, Global Warming, and the Terrible Cost of Comfort. This book, it might make sense to talk about where or how this book began. I had been wanting to write about climate change for a while, and also as a way to educate myself about the climate crisis. But it was so overwhelming and I didn't know where to start. And about 6 years ago, I had a close friend of mine who is from nearby the area, actually, Shaker Heights. And he, his partner, who's also a friend of mine, said, "You should really talk to Sam. His job is so weird. And I feel like you should write about it." I kind of ignored her for a little bit. And then eventually I was in a situation where we started talking. And my friend Rebecca was completely right. Sam's job was quite bizarre and fascinating, and to my look, a way into the climate crisis. So what he was doing at the time, he's no longer employed this way, but he was driving around the country. He was working for a green energy startup. He was driving around the country searching for used Freon on the secondary market. Freon, chemical refrigerant, better known as, Freon is a brand name, but it's probably best to call it CFCs, because Freon is still used, the brand name is still used, but the chemicals are very different. So CFCs quite famously caused the ozone hole, depletion of the ozone, which is the only thing that protects us from the sun's most violent radiation. Without the ozone layer, there would be no life possible on this earth. So in the 70s and 80s, we had the ozone crisis, which was caused by the CFCs. Production of CFCs is banned. No one makes CFCs anymore. But buying and selling it on the secondary market is quite legal. And as it turns out, it's happening a lot more than people think it is. People stockpiled Freon. Freon was smuggled. There's a chapter in the book where I talk about this rampant Freon smuggling ring that happened at the end of the 90s, it became the #1 smuggled illicit substance over cocaine. And in fact, it was more profitable than crack. And they tamped down on that pretty quickly. But it just goes to show you how in demand this chemical was. So Sam had discovered that it was all over the United States still, even 25 years after its ban, and people were buying and selling it quite readily. And the real reason for that is still a bit of a mystery, but people thought that think that it works better. There was some aspect of nostalgia. They didn't know what else to do with it. So he was buying this up from people and then destroying it. And through California's cap and trade system, by destroying this chemical, which is terrible for the ozone and is also a super global warming gas, it heats the planet to an extreme effect. And through that cap and trade system in California, his company could get carbon offset credits. And so essentially they were making money by destroying Freon. So this in itself was quite bizarre, but I also discovered that who he was meeting was very interesting to me. Sam considers himself a kind of environmental activist, is a business person, but is trying to align his business goals with his environmental goals. And he was meeting and buying Freon from these people that were often global warming deniers, often very, very conservative. And if they found out that he was going to destroy Freon and get carbon credits from it, they often would not sell him the refrigerant because he was one of the carbon guys. But because Sam is who he is, a very patient person and very tenacious, he was able to establish a business relationship with a lot of these people and have frank conversations about global warming with them. So this was really what struck me most. I went on a brief road trip with him to see it for myself. And this is really what structures part of the book, is a first-person account of my going with Sam on the road trip to buy Freon from some of his clients. And they were quite a colorful cast of characters. But, you know, in a moment where we're told over and over and over again that the United States has never been more divided politically, I thought, here's a really interesting moment to show people meeting across that divide. And in some cases, having frank conversations about politically tough topics. That is to say, climate change. So the book has two modes. One is this road trip with Sam. And then the other mode is a very broad history of air conditioning, mostly in the United States. So there's a section on before Freon. There was air conditioning before Freon. And then when the chemical Freon, CFCs were invented, and the sort of age of Freon and the ozone crisis. And then the last section is after Freon. So the kind of ghostly, zombie-like afterlife of CFCs that we're still experiencing in this planet. So it's really partially a history and then partially a road trip narrative. And I think of it as a book-length essay that really considers what we're doing cooling in the first place. And I should maybe say right off the bat that it's not anti-air conditioning, nor is it really a set of policy proposals or solutions. And I think that it's really important to say that because a lot of people, when they encounter a book about the climate crisis, they want to know, well, what's the solution? But actually, we know what the solutions are. There's a great book and publication that came out of that book called the Drawdown. The publication is called the Drawdown Review. The Drawdown Review constantly revises those solutions with some of the best scientists around, and it's peer reviewed and all this sort of thing. And actually, there was just a book, a great collection of essays that is partially edited by one of the Drawdown Review's editors, Catherine Wilkinson called All We Can Save. And in the back, it has this great index that's a list of all the solutions. And the number one climate solution is refrigerant management. It's this exactly. So we know what the solutions are. And the book is really an attempt not to just put forth a bunch of technological solutions, but it's quite skeptical of turning to technological solutions. And rather, it's an attempt to really try to think through some of the hard questions that are psychological, that are cultural, and that revolve around mostly the concept of comfort. So, you know, the book attempts to try to define comfort. What does that mean? Is comfort fixed, or is it something that can really change? And the book is really adamant about a lot of the evidence that's coming out that what we think of as personal comfort is actually highly constructed. It's a social construction. There's a kind of American comfort that's becoming more and more prevalent in the rest of the world, but it didn't always used to be that way. The United States has really exported its definition of comfort to the other parts of the world that are becoming more and more industrialized. So the book is really a challenge for us, not necessarily to be uncomfortable all the time or to suffer or to not use air conditioning even, but to really try to radically redefine what we mean by comfort, because air conditioning, which is ironically making the planet hotter, and while it makes only a select few of the planet's population colder, and is often actually not a great solution to a heat wave, which we can get into later if we'd like. This is really not making our planet more comfortable for everyone at all. So the book is really a challenge to that, to the idea of what we think of as comfort, and a challenge for us to expand our notion of comfort rather than getting rid of it altogether. I think that's a pretty broad overview.
I think you did a great job, Eric.
Thanks.
Now I get to pepper you with questions, both mine and the audience. So
Fantastic.
I want to encourage you, the audience, to submit questions, because I certainly don't represent every opinion about cooling. But I want to start with the building code, Eric.
Yes.
I think it's really interesting that we call our building code that refers to air conditioning HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And it's an international building code, and I know that we say that residences don't have a right to air conditioning, but I would venture to ask, do you know anything about the statistics of new homes being built with air conditioning?
Well, it's a great question. I don't know these statistics right off the bat, but it depends on where you are. So if you're in the United States, most vast majority of new homes have air conditioning. But what's what's interesting to think about is that before we even get there, the vast majority of new homes are built to require air conditioning. And this didn't always used to be the case. This is a legacy of post-World War II housing developments, which were often so shoddily built, so cheaply built, and didn't take into account the outside environment at all. Because why would you if you could control it inside your little box? And we think of that as kind of, in the United States, just the way that it is. You shouldn't really have to necessarily think about the local climate because you have air conditioning or you have heating in a way that can control that. But that, of course, has consequences. It has energy consequences. And there's, hundreds and hundreds of years of wisdom on how to passively cool a space through appropriate building materials, through shade, and through certain innovative design. And so that's one of the things that I think is really worth thinking about on a structural level is, we don't have a kind of federal mandate for the way that buildings should cool. And we really should, because it obviously makes a huge difference on the energy impact. And as you pointed out, interestingly enough, most places like New York City, for instance, where I am, if you're a tenant, if you're a renter, it's required by law that your landlord provide heating for you. Interestingly, it's not required by law for tenants to have air conditioning. So what's curious about that is that then air conditioning kind of cuts pretty closely sometimes around race and class lines. So who has air conditioning and who doesn't becomes a mark between not just the privileged and the not privileged, but who might survive and who doesn't, although it's more complicated than that.
Eric,
yeah.
Can I ask you about public buildings? Are they required to be air conditioned now?
I'm not sure, actually. I think it depends on, I think most of them go by what's called the Standard 55, which is a set of rules and regulations by the HVAC industry called ASHRAE to mandate that. But I actually don't know if it's by law. I mean, I'm not sure that... I'm actually not sure if there's a law on the books.
It seemed to me that it would be wonderful to offer credits to people that perhaps investigate alternative cooling methods besides air conditioning.
That sounds like a great idea, and maybe you should run for office. We need people who are thinking that, because I think that's exactly the sort of right thinking, because up until this point, it's really, especially in domestic spaces, it's left up into the individual consumer. And when you get to that, you have a whole lot of problems that come up, including taxing the energy grid.
I think that if I understand this correctly, there are unintended consequences of air conditioning, and the biggest one is an increase in global warming.
That's right. So in the United States, air conditioning can heat in at least two ways. The first one is directly. Actually more than two ways. The biggest one probably is through the refrigerant. So the refrigerant is basically what allows air conditioning to happen. It's a gas at room temperature that expands and contracts. And by expanding and contracting, it cools the air around it. Technically, refrigerants stay within the air conditioner. They're not released or emitted when you turn your air conditioner on. You can technically reuse, expand and contract that refrigerant forever. But we don't live in a world that's full of technicalities and perfection. What happens is that the refrigerant often leaks very slowly over time, or people get rid of an air conditioner, throw it out, for instance, and then the the refrigerant leaks that way. Even though that's illegal, you're supposed to have somebody to come and suck the refrigerant out, but it's really hard to police that. It's really hard to regulate that. So once those refrigerants go into the atmosphere. So I should say we don't use CFCs anymore. We use the replacement, which is HFCs, or sometimes HCFCs. Both of those are super global warming gases. The HFCs don't really deplete the ozone layer, but they are incredibly powerful global warming gases. And we sort of knew this from the beginning. It was always supposed to be a bridge. But we don't do very well with bridge chemicals, because the infrastructure gets laid and it's hard to change from that. So the United States has just signaled that it's going to move away from HFCs, but there's a lot of uncertainties although there is a way forward chemically. So that's the first way that's directly. The second way is indirectly, which is through energy. So the cooling for energy is enormous. It's something like, in the United States, like 10% of the energy used is cooling in domestic spaces. I don't remember the exact percentage off the top of my head, but it's something close to that. What's really, really crucial to remember, however, is that the United States uses more energy for air conditioning than any other country. And it uses more energy per person than any other country. So China has about twice as many air conditioners, actual units, as the United States. Thousands and thousands and thousands of times more. Or sorry, thousands and thousands, thousands of more air conditioners. But they use a fraction of the energy that we do. So they don't use it nearly as much. And there are some parts of China that are as hot, if not hotter, than parts of the United States. So all to say that it's not like everyone is using air conditioning the same. The United States, where air conditioning was born, is particularly addicted to it. And not just in places that are extremes like Phoenix, Arizona, for instance, which, as far as I could tell, could not exist in the way that it does now without air conditioning. But in places like New York, where really, except in very, very unusual circumstances, like a weekend or a heat wave that comes, you really don't need air conditioning in New York. And yet, every space is air conditioned. So this is really what my focus is these kinds of the way that we unthinkingly cool because we're not aware, or it's not so clear to us what the consequences of that are.
So the average consumer can probably attempt to improve the world a little if we did with a little less air conditioning in our life. But are there other ways? I'm a little concerned about this black market with Freon and how much Freon is out there that we have to sort of get back. I know it's not just strictly Freon, but it's all going to harm the ozone layer. How much is out there that we need to sort of get our hands around and protect?
Yeah, well, so you bring up sort of two things that are equally great questions. One is sort of what can the individual consumer do? Huge question. And also, I am not one to think that we get into this habit, especially in the United States, to think about like, oh, well, then I won't buy that, or I will buy this because it's better. But that kind of consumer activism doesn't really work, right? You need something at the level of the political leaders and policy, and in this case, also international regulation. But sometimes I think there's an overcorrection when we talk about systemic change, which is crucial. We need those laws on the books that will begin to regulate things. But how do those laws come into effect? They come into effect because enough people from below push it to happen. And how do enough people from below push that to happen? Well, you have to get enough people on board who care about this. So it's a dialectic. It's not just political leaders who are changing everything for us. We're supposed to live in a representative democracy. So it depends on who they're representing and how much noise those people are making who they represent. It's my conviction that enough ordinary citizens like you and me don't raise hell about climate change enough. We should be not just talking about this, but we should be calling our senators and our elected officials about this every day, even those who are working on this. That's what it's going to take, because it's not going to be, Exxon out of the good of their heart choosing to, become net zero. So that's sort of the one question, is that I think it's, the book focuses more on the cultural and psychological aspects of this, en masse. but is also deeply aware that what we need is systemic change. The other question that you asked is sort of about how worried should we be about the refrigerants that are out there? Well, again, there's only so much that an individual person can do about this. But I think it's an interesting and a really important point to think about in terms of what we put out in the world. I think that it's particularly, I'll use the example of a very common sort of environmental concept, which is reduce, reuse, recycle. But the United States has really forgotten about those first two. We're focused on recycling, which actually has little and less effect in the world. There's a great comedian and climate policy grad student who's made a set of YouTube videos. And his name is Raleigh Williams, and he has a great one on recycling, about how recycling is more or less a scam. You should totally recycle. You should always recycle because there's the chance that it won't. But he kind of goes through the whole systemic way of that it doesn't do that much. So the most important part of that is reduce. But we're so reluctant to do that. So back to your point about how worried should we be about these chemicals? This is really the job of corporations, and also cleanup companies, and also the federal government to do that. But it's something that as a culture, we really have to get better at doing, which is not to focus on cleaning it up after the mess has already been made, but to focus on not making the mess in the first place, not proliferating these chemicals, and at such levels that it becomes very, very difficult to clean up. Even though I think CFCs pose a really good picture at what happens when you ban a chemical that is wanted, and the replacement chemicals are set to do the exact same thing. I have a feeling we're going to have some form of a smuggling ring, exactly like how we did with CFCs, because when you ban something like that, and it becomes more expensive to get the alternative chemicals, you're going to have a black market for them. It's just going to happen. And so we should really be thinking about that with things like oil and natural gas too. What are ways to make sustainable living in general more desirable and easier for everyone, so that we don't even want the old chemicals? I think that's what's really important, is a certain mainstream of environmentalism sometimes gets hooked on this idea of what we have to give up or what we have to sacrifice. But I think when you're using that rhetoric, it really turns people off. And I think it doesn't work that well. So this is why I'm trying to sort of think about how we can redefine comfort, is that if we understand that in order to actually have more comfort and comfort for everyone on the planet, then it won't feel like a sacrifice to give these things up. It'll actually feel like something that we really desire and want to do. And so that's sort of a big idea, but I hope that makes sense.
It does. Mary has a question about how cities are heat islands, and does the planting of trees help reverse some of that?
Thank you, Mary. That's I was going to talk about that and I totally forgot. You're so right. So there's actually sort of a third way that air conditioning, individual air conditioners especially, make cities hotter, and it's through the urban heat island effect. So, you have to think about it. When you cool something mechanically, it doesn't just magically become cool. What you're doing is you're kind of moving the heat elsewhere. We were talking about the laws of thermodynamics earlier. But you can't just like generate cooling. You have to sort of borrow it from somewhere else. So what happens is that when you have a bunch of people in a city like New York, for instance, or Brooklyn, where I am, I'm like looking out of my courtyard and I can see about 20 air conditioners hanging out of the window. What happens is that you get a bunch of machines that are blowing hot air into the air that are making the city a lot hotter. So you get places in the depths of that city that are 10 degrees hotter than the surrounding area.
18,000.
Wait a second. I think we're getting a little bit of interference.
Mom, I made dinner. Stop criticizing me.
Brianna, if that's you, could you mute your button for us,
Oh, I'm
please?
so sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, great. So it can get as much as like 10 degrees hotter. This is a huge problem in India where it can get quite hot, and the more air conditioners that people have had, the hotter the cities has gotten. And the people who are inside the air conditioned spaces will be okay, but the people outside of them, of course, are suffering from that. Trees are a huge help in this. This is the good news, is that there are really low tech solutions like trees, for instance. Trees can. It's a bit complicated, but trees can absorb heat, but they can also shade structures. So, in my neighborhood, I'm lucky to have. I live in Flatbush in Brooklyn, and I'm lucky to live next to the park. And some days, on really hot days, I'll take a hammock and I'll go to the center of the park where there's a bunch of trees, and I'll string it up between two trees, and it's so much cooler there. Partially because of the shade, but partially because the trees can absorb that heat. And the unfortunate thing, the terrible thing, is that this is definitely true in New York, and I know it's true in other cities. But if you often look at a map of where there is the most foliage and vegetation in a city, they are often in the wealthier, more privileged parts of the city. In Brooklyn, the further east you get, the more it's working class neighborhoods of Black and brown people, and the less trees you get. And that's not a coincidence. It's that those neighborhoods are not being invested in because they don't make the city as much money, even though the people who live there are really working to make the city money. So this is something that can be fixed at the local level, although trees take time to grow, of course. There's that, if anyone's read that, the novel, The Overstory by Richard Powers, there's that sort of joke in it that says the best time to plant a tree was yesterday and the second best time is today. So that's definitely a very tangible solution, that at the municipal level, we can have better access to parks, better access to tree-lined structures, and everybody likes that, right?
Eric, could you talk a little bit about the relationship between race and cooling? I know you've kind of touched on it, but I think it needs mentioned again.
Absolutely. So this was one of the huge surprises for me in researching this book. It was one of those things that I wasn't really looking for, although now in retrospect, I shouldn't have been so surprised. From its earliest moments, the history of cooling has been wrapped up in systemic racism and also the history of eugenics. Benjamin Franklin, at the end of the 18th century, successfully mechanically cooled air in a tube. He wasn't the first person to do it. He was copying an experiment of somebody else. And this was often noted in the histories that I saw. But what wasn't noted was the rest of the letter where he describes this. So I looked it up and found out, because I was curious, how does he describe this cooling experiment? And in it, this is in the I said late 18th century. I think it was the 1740s or 1750s. He is talking about what a great thing this could be to artificially cool. And then kind of in the next paragraph, he talks about how white men will need this, but the Africans who are enslaved in the fields, because they come from Africa, they don't need it because it's hotter there. This, of course, is nonsense and is a totally racist logic, although it's not uncommon for the time. It was quite common for people to think that Africans, for instance, who had come from sub-Saharan Africa, were better equipped evolutionarily to handle the heat. Again, that's not true. And so it was from the very first moment that it entered into the United States, denied, on logic to Black Americans. Fast forward decades and decades and decades to the 20th century, and we see this pattern happening again and again. To speed it up more into the present era, post World War II, this is a huge issue in World War II housing with redlining. I mean, quite famously, Richard Rothstein has written a great book on this called The Color of Law, where he talks about how often white-only enclaves or mostly white enclaves in post-World War II housing were booming. And it was very easy for white families to get housing mortgages that incidentally included air conditioning in their package. And it was denied to non-white residents, not just Black residents, but Jewish residents and others as well. Anyone who was seen at the time as non-white. So for a very long time, there was this enormous gap between not only who had a house and who didn't, but who had air conditioning and who did not. Because that was wrapped up in who could get a mortgage and who could not. This was all related to the GI Bill, which was actually quite racist. And then fast forwarding into the present day is that, that gap closed considerably, but not all the way. And so something that I talk about in the book is in 2019, there was a terrible heat wave in New York. And there was a blackout in Brooklyn. And this was curious because it was not a blackout because something failed, but because Con Ed, the monopoly energy company, chose to deliberately cut off energy to certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn in order to preserve the integrity of the whole. Those were their exact words. This is not uncommon. And the neighborhoods that they chose to do this in were predominantly Black and Latino working class neighborhoods in East Brooklyn. So, so that's sort
Eric,
of a broad...
is there a generational expectation of cooling? Is there a generational difference?
I think at this point, I'm not sure. I don't think so, because at this point, even our elders are so used to cooling, and they're often the ones who need it the most, because they're the ones most vulnerable to heat. I have found that there's less generational expectation to it than there is a cultural or national expectation. I meet a lot of people talk to a lot of people from places like Ecuador or Colombia or India, who didn't grow up with air conditioning, but grew up in 90 and sometimes 100-degree weather summers, which is not to say that that's fine. If it's 100 degrees, that's quite dangerous, and you need to mitigate the heat somehow. But you don't always have to mitigate it with air conditioning. There's other ways. People in India have been doing this for centuries. And you also can't expect to work during that. It's an emergency. And part of what I think is our crisis is that we don't treat heat waves and hot weather events like the emergency that they are. We just put on some air conditioning and then we expect to work with the exact same efficiency as we did before. But that's really not realistic, especially in a world that's getting hotter and hotter.
What can you tell me about humidity in air? There clearly is a relationship there, and maybe you can just speak to that a little.
You're totally right. So humidity matters a lot. There were early air conditioning engineers, the ones who really figured out how to air condition, knew this. The one who really mastered it was Willis Carrier, whose name continues today with Carrier air conditioners. And the reason why this matters, we know this intuitively and culturally because there's the saying, it's not the heat, it's the humidity. And the reason for that is that our bodies are actually quite good at cooling, much in the way that an air conditioner does. And that's through sweating. By putting out sweat onto our skin, and if you let that sweat be exposed to the air, in dry air, it will evaporate. And the evaporation is what causes cooling on the skin. And it's remarkably effective. If you're sweating and you're in dry air, then you can become quite cool. And we can also like artificially induce this by like misting our faces or something like that and standing in front of a fan. But when you're in a really humid environment, the air is saturated with water, either all the way or mostly. And so it's really difficult for the moisture to evaporate because it doesn't really have anything to evaporate into. When the air is already, it's like a wet sponge. A wet sponge is not a great thing to absorb water from because it's already saturated. So when the air is like a wet sponge, your cooling system doesn't work. And if your cooling system doesn't work, then it gets, you can get hotter to dangerous levels. So it's like being in a sauna.
So Lee has the most important question of the day. What are the alternatives to cooling aside from planting trees and sweating?
So, well, there's lots of levels to think about. So at the sort of systemic level, I think the most important thing is better design. The best architects are thinking about ways of designing buildings that hardly need air conditioning at all. One of the best examples of this that's mentioned in the book is the late architect Zaha Hadid, who was a brilliant architect, no longer alive, unfortunately. She designed this building in Saudi Arabia in the middle of the desert, which is the Petroleum Studies Institute, actually. And it does use some cooling, but not nearly as much as you would think. And the way that it does that is because she designed these hive-like structures that are inspired by insects like bees and termites and things like that. And it catches the wind that's coming naturally from a certain direction and it reroutes it into these open air courtyards. It also prevents direct sunlight from coming in. And it keeps it remarkably cool. Now, it's a little bit easier there because it is literally in the desert, so you don't have to deal with the humidity there. But still, there are ways to do that. And so at the systemic level, great design is really crucial. There are better refrigerant alternatives. There's a sort of new family called HFOs, and we're going back to some of the natural refrigerants too. So technology is important in that sense, but I'm always wary of only focusing on technology because when we do that, we're still using a level of energy that might be unsustainable, even if we're going to a renewable energy grid, because where are all those lithium batteries coming from, for instance? When you change the environment, when you have that level of energy, that energy has to come from somewhere. And then just on the personal level, I want to emphasize that everyone should take care of themselves. Everyone is different. You should never put yourself in a dangerous situation. However, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, which is very humid and hot in the summers. I grew up in entirely air-conditioned spaces in the summer. But when I moved to New York, my level of comfort sort of didn't change at all. I still air-conditioned in the summer the same amount. I was surprised to find through the process of writing this book, I sort of challenged myself to test my limits. And I was incredibly surprised at how flexible they were, quite flexible. So flexible that I don't use air conditioning now. And when I first moved here, it wasn't that much hotter, or that much cooler, I mean, or that much hotter, sorry. I use it all the time. And so part of that was learning that my level of comfort could change, and also learning to do things like position fans in a really effective manner. Creating a cross breeze in an apartment or a house, if you can do that, is great. Not everyone could do that though. And also just getting kind of comfortable being sweaty and gross. There's a cultural element to that we don't want to be seen as sweating because it's inappropriate, right? But our bodies do that for a reason, and there shouldn't be anything wrong with that. And so sometimes also maybe the most important thing is regulating our level of work and our expectation. Again, not everybody has the opportunity to do that, but I don't think that we can solve the climate problem without also solving our work problem. Because when you are working so much, that requires energy to do that. And we have to really consider whether we need to be working that much.
Eric, we've talked a great deal about structures. Let's talk about vehicles.
Yeah.
It would seem to me that we produce a great number of vehicles, and I would venture to say almost all of them have air conditioning now.
That's right.
Are there incentives for people to purchase vehicles without air conditioning or to be manufactured without air conditioning?
Yeah, it's such a great point. And, air conditioning refrigerant in cars is particularly leaky. So it's a huge problem, actually. This might be controversial, but I'm going to say it. I think that car air conditioning is one of the easy, less complicated problems. I think air conditioning is always situational and can be complex, in indoor spaces. But with cars, I think it's pretty easy. And for the most part, you don't need them. There are exceptions, people driving for very long hours across the country, for instance. But the reason for that is that the vast majority of car trips, they've done lots of studies on this. The vast majority of car trips are under 25 minutes, vast majority. You can sweat it out for 25 minutes, even when you're in Phoenix. You're not going to die. And you're not even going to be that uncomfortable. So I think that air conditioning in cars, I'm not a policy person, so I'm not sure how to regulate that. I'm not sure how to fix that, but it's something that every car has and every car uses. It also guzzles gas, like way more gas when you turn the air conditioning on. It's not something that's really needed at all because that was
my question.
Yeah.
To cool those engines, we don't use the air conditioning, do we? It's a complete different system.
Correct. Yep. It's a coolant, actually, which is not a refrigerant. And I have no idea how that works. But it's the air, cars didn't have air conditioning until really the 70s. And what's really wild is that we went from having no car that was air conditioned to having, by the 90s, something like 99% of American cars were air conditioned. And a lot of, it's changing now in the rest of the world, but it wasn't until recently that a lot of European cars were, they used to not be air conditioned either, but they're getting on that trend as well. And you really don't need it.
Eric, I'm surprised how much I've learned about cooling having read your book. It's something I really never thought a great deal about until today. I'm in the process, though, of replacing my freezer since it died. And perhaps this would be a great time to reuse instead of go purchase new. I don't know. I'll have to investigate that.
That's right. And, and that's a problem that comes up with it. And it's why people recycle, is that sometimes it's a lot of time invested into thinking about how you can reuse, or like a lot of research and things like that. But a lot of times it's time well spent. So I commend you if you decide to do that. That's great.
Well, thank you. Do you have any parting thoughts for us that you think are about cooling in general, other than we need to sort of pay attention to it a little more?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I was going to say, is that, like, I think the first step is really paying attention, noticing it. It's quite unspectacular. It's literally invisible. And it's all around us, and it's really reshaping our world in violent ways, I would say. So I think paying attention to it is the first step. I mean, the other thing I would say is that is to really get engaged with the political process, especially at the local level. Everyone should be doing this because the climate crisis is something that, while it affects us all unevenly, it still affects us all. And we have to be very vocal and in conversation with each other and our political leaders, our elected leaders. And you don't have to get things at the, you don't have to change things at the federal level. Cities and local communities can make a huge difference when you have enough, if you got all of New York and LA and Chicago to go completely renewable energy. That's a huge portion of the population. So, and it would push federal legislation. So that would be my parting thought, is to really become active in your community, in talking with people, and also talking with people about how to make a change. Because, I don't have a master plan, nor would it would be kind of messed up if I did. But we have to work on this together, and we have to talk about it and listen to each other about it.
Well, I think the first step is reading Eric's book, everybody. I would strongly recommend you read Eric Dean Wilson's book on after cooling. I know that I personally learned a good deal. Oh, we have one quick question. Lee wants to know your friend who talks about recycling. Could you repeat his name?
Oh, yeah. His name's Raleigh Williams, and he has a great YouTube channel called Climate Town, which is both very funny and very informative. A good combination.
But as I said, you can purchase Eric's book at the Learned Owl. You can come to the library and check it out, and multiple people could reuse the book. We are very fortunate that you took the time to sort of speak with us tonight, and I wish you well in your endeavor. I hope that you write more and investigate more on some of these issues for us. If people have a desire to reach out to him, I would suggest you read the book, and you might be able to find some contact information for him as well. Thank you so much, Eric. You've really educated me, and I hope that you educate millions more of me.
Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I wish for you a cool evening.
You too.
Good night, all.